In this session, we are going to learn how to use AWS CodeDeploy to do hybrid deployments. AWS CodeDeploy can do deployments to your on-premise instances, to other cloud service providers, maybe to your laptop. So let's first go through the steps involved in creating a hybrid deployment in a very high level. So the first thing you need to do is to understand the two different environments. So you have AWS on your left side and your on-premise instance, which probably if you are doing this in a lab environment, you are going to use your laptop. You will need to install some software on your laptop to do this lab exercise. First step is to install AWS tools for PowerShell on your laptop or on-premise instance. So this comes as an MSI package, so the installation is super easy. The next step is to install AWS CodeDeploy Agent on your laptop or on-premise instance. CodeDeploy Agent also comes as an MSI package. So if you are going to run this one on a Windows environment, it's super easy to install. The next step is to create an IAM user called My On-Premise Machine User, which will have access to an S3 bucket. Of course, you can attach a fine-grained permission that allows access to a certain folder in an S3 bucket. The purpose of this user is to allow the CodeDeploy agent to download the software from a specific S3 location. You are then going to create an IAM user called My CodeDeploy On-Prem Reg User with certain AWS CodeDeploy permissions that allows you to register the on-premise instance with AWS CodeDeploy. So this is going to be a temporary user. So once you register your on-premise instance, you can of course delete it. We use this user only to register the on-premise user. Then we are going to create a file called conf on-premises YAML file in this special folder if it is a Windows machine. And once you create this file, it will have certain access key and secret key of my on-premise machine user, which the AWS CodeDeploy agent will use to access the S3 bucket. So these credentials can be rotated, but the way to do that is a bit more complicated. So if you look at the documentation, you will find the art of changing these credentials. Then you are going to use a special PowerShell command called register cd on-premise instance. And we are going to execute this PowerShell command in the context of my CodeDeploy on-prem reg user that has access to AWS CodeDeploy. So from the time that you execute this command, it's going to register your on-premise instance or your laptop with AWS CodeDeploy with a special name. So once it is in the AWS CodeDeploy, you can create a new deployment group called My Hybrid Environment and then target your deployments into that environment. When the CodeDeploy registers the on-premise instance with AWS CodeDeploy, you can tag that instance with any name that you like. So this is the high-level steps that involves when doing a hybrid deployment or first configuring the hybrid environment. So let's go there and then do these steps and then learn how to do a hybrid deployment. Installation of AWS tools for Windows PowerShell is super easy. All what you need to do is to go to this web page and then download AWS tools for Windows PowerShell. This will give you an MSI installer, and it's a matter of going through a few steps and then clicking next. So showing the folder, run this SDK, run the MSI installer, and then click next, accept the terms and license. You can install all the plugins if you want. Click next and install. This will install PowerShell commandlets that you can use to interact with AWS services. installation is complete, and open PowerShell window. If I type get AWS PowerShell version, you will find that if the installation is successful, you will get this number. So I have installed AWS tools for Windows PowerShell. Installation of AWS CodeDeploy Agent is also super easy. If you go into AWS CodeDeploy documentation, there's a section that describes install or reinstall AWS CodeDeploy Agent. So it explains methods to install it on, for example, in the Windows machine. And there's another section that describes how to install it on Linux machine. So if you go into install it on, for example, Windows Server, it describes the steps to install it. You can install this one using PowerShell commandlet. Alternatively, you can do it with the help of the user interface. This location gives you the place to download the MSI installer. So depending on the region that you are in, you can select where to download it from. So right now I'm based in Sydney region, so I can use this URL, for example, to download it. So I download my CodeDeploy agent. I can do this one programmatically if I want, using PowerShell commandlets to download it from S3 bucket and then run the program. But I like to use the user interface to run it. So I download my CodeDeploy agent and let's run it. It's an MSI installer, and it's going to go through a few steps, and then we will install the CodeDeploy agent. It finished installing the CodeDeploy agent. If you want to make sure that it's running fine, you can go to your services. So I'm in my services. Make sure that your CodeDeploy host agent service is running. You can find that the host is running, and it is running as a local system account. If you go to the general, you can find where it got installed. So if you go into Amazon, this location, Amazon, if you go into C program data, Amazon CodeDeploy folder, you can find that the CodeDeploy has been set up over here. And this program data is a hidden folder. So if you type it here, you should be able to access it. So as of now, you can find there are a few binaries that it's running, and the log of this one is available here. You can find that as of now, it will be giving some errors because it doesn't know how to connect into AWS CodeDeploy, and there's no credentials specified. So it says it's trying to reach into a network, but it's trying to keep failing. So my CodeDeploy agent was installed successfully, and it's running in the background. The next step is to create an IAM user. So let's go into the identity and access management of AWS. Go to users, add a user. The name of the user is my on-premises machine user. It's going to have programmatic access. So this is the user we are going to use as part of AWS CodeDeploy agent. And AWS CodeDeploy agent will use this user to access AWS S3 bucket to download the software artifacts. Click next permission. We can give fine-grained permissions allowing access to our S3 bucket where we deliver software artifacts as part of our bit pipeline. Alternatively, I'm here following the easy approach, and I'm only going to give Amazon S3 read-only access. This gives access to all our S3 bucket, but ideally in production environment, you need to give only access to a specific folder in your S3 bucket or only to a specific S3 bucket. Because this is a lab environment, I'm going to give S3 read-only access for all of my S3 buckets. Click next, click review, and it will give Amazon S3 read-only access. Create the user. You can keep track of this access key ID and the secret access key in a safe location. Save this detail in a safe location because we are going to use these credentials shortly. Close the window. We are going to create another user which we are going to use to register the on-premise instance. Let's create another user. Name of the user is my CodeDeploy on-prem reg user. It's going to have programmatic access. Click next permissions. Here also you can give fine-grained permissions, but in this case I'm going to attach AWS CodeDeploy full access, which will allow me to register my AWS instance. Click next. Click the next review. AWS CodeDeploy full access. So this has permissions to register my on-premise instance with AWS. So create the user. And also note down this access key and the secret key. Now two users, my on-premise machine user, which I'm going to use to access S3 bucket. And this is going to stay with that machine for a long time. And I have my CodeDeploy on-prem reg user, which I'm going to use to register my on-premise instance with AWS. Close this windows. And I have the two users. In case you find these credentials you forget these credentials, you can still go into the user security credentials. You can mark the current one inactive, and you can always create a new access key if you want. The next step is to add the conf.onpremises.yaml file. So depending on what kind of server you are installing, it's going to be in different locations. For if you are using a Ubuntu server, for example, it should be in this location. But if you are on a Windows server, by default, it should be this location. The place where the CodeDeploy look for this conf.onpremises YAML file in the Windows instance, you can configure. Instead of this location, you can put it into, for example, a network share location. In that case, you need to tell the CodeDeploy what to do. And CodeDeploy has a file called a configuration file, which you can find in this folder if you are on a Windows instance. And here in this configuration file, you can specify the folder name, the file name, on-premises config file. And instead of using the default location, you can specify your custom location. But in this case, I'm going to use this default location of program data Amazon CodeDeploy and conf.onpremises.yaml file. The format of the YAML file has to be like this. And also it has to end with line feed character. It should not be line feed and carriage return and line feed character, but it has to end with only line feed characters. Luckily for you, if you go into your development environment, you can manually create that YAML file, but if you miss some spaces, it can be a problem. So I have created under C div helpers. If you go into CodeDeploy, there's this conf on-premises YAML file. You can open it with Visual Studio Code. Once you open it, you can find that the line termination is set it as LF, line feed. You can add the access key and the secret key and the user ARN and the region where this CodeDeploy agent will use, which AWS CodeDeploy agent is going to use. So the access key ID should be the access key ID of the on-premises instance that the use of the on-premises instance. To do that, save. So this is the user that I created for on-premises instance, my on-premises machine user. Access key is this one, so copy it. Make sure that you add that access key here. And the secret access key is this one. Add the secret key. And the IAM user ARN. So this is the Amazon resource name of the user that we created. So this one is wrong. So let's just console, go to IAM section. Under users, we already created a user called on-premises machine user, and the ARN is this one. So this account ID may be different for you, and the username is like this. So copy it, and then you can specify the ARN of that user. So I have the access key and the secret key of this user in this on-premises YAML file. I'm in Sydney region, so I put this region as App Southeast 2, but if you're in a different region, you need to specify it. You can copy this saved YAML file and then paste it in your on-premise environment or laptop. So I'm in my laptop. I go into C program data Amazon CodeDeploy, and I'm going to paste that configuration file. So I have conf on-premises file copied into my laptop. So it's in good condition. The next step, of course, is to restart the service, so it will pick up these connections. Go to services. Go to CodeDeploy. Stop the service. Once the service is stopped, you can start the service again. That will pick up the new credentials. Once the service started, you can go to the log files and then inspect the log file for possible errors. So if you go to the end of this file, seems like it's successfully connect into this user, using this user, and seems like it's working. So what I did was I created this conf on-premises YAML file. I make sure that it's ending with line feed characters. So if you disable this one, you can find that there's a hidden character and the ending is line feed. And I specify the access key, secret key, and the user ARN. And the CodeDeploy binary is running in this bin folder. Took this on-premises one and then managed to connect into AWS. It's very important to understand if you want to change these credentials. So right now it's a static one. So at some point in time, if you want to have temporary credentials, there's another method to do that. There is a more advanced method to configure the AWS CodeDeploy agent to AWS using a session method. So this is called IAM session ARN. We will not go into details around how to set this one up. It's a more advanced method, but it gives you the ability to use temporary credentials instead of using this IAM user secret key and access key. If you are more interested in this kind of a security implementation, go and read about this article and you will find more interesting way to set the security for your on-premise instance. But this is a lab session, so we are comfortable in using the simple method. The next step is to register my on-premises instance with AWS CodeDeploy. To do that, go to CodeDeploy. And once you register, it will appear under on-premises instance. So as of now, I don't have any registered on-premises instance. So let's try to register an on-premises instance here. To do that, we are going to use the command called register cd on-premises instance. And I'm going to give the user ARN, which this registration will use once done. And I'm also going to give an instance name to identify my on-premises instance. So let's try to do that. I have opened PowerShell. First step is to set the credentials. set AWS credentials for this session. I need to provide the access key. It's going to be the access key of this code deployment on-prem registration user, because that's the one that has permission to register the on-premises instance, and the secret key. Press enter. You also need to set the default region. In my case, I'm running it in App Southeast 2, which is the Sydney region. In your case, it may be a different region. So I set the AWS credential and default region for this PowerShell session. And the next step is to run the PowerShell command to register CD on-premises instance. I need to give the ARN. And the IAM user ARN is the user ARN of the on-premises instance. So let's go into our AWS console. You go into IAM section. Under users, ARN of this on-premises machine user is the one we should use, which has S3 Amazon read-only access so that it can download the software artifacts. That's the ARN. And I can then give an instance name. Instance name, in this case, I'm going to give it as my Lenovo laptop, or let's call it my laptop, because I'm doing it in my laptop. So let's give it a name like my laptop. So for you, you can define an instance name to identify your on-premises instance. Registration is complete. If I go into AWS CodeDeploy, under on-premises instance, you can find that my laptop is registered, and the IAM user ARN is going to use is my on-premises instance machine user. If this machine needs different AWS access permissions, you can of course attach those permissions to this IAM user. So the registration is complete. The next step is to do a deployment that will target this on-premises instance. You need to define a tag to identify my laptop. So let's first do that. Select the instance. Under tags, click edit. You can give any arbitrary name. So I will select something like env. Value can be something like any value that you want to identify this instance. So in my case, let's say my pre-prod. Submit. So I created the key as environment and the value as my pre-prod. So if you have multiple instances, you can use the same environment key and the value. The next step is to go to the applications, and under my Donkey application test, let's create a deployment group. Select it. Under deployment groups, we already have the pre-production deployment that we created before. But in this case, it's going to be a new deployment group. So let's create a new deployment group. Give it a name. Let's call it my hybrid env. That's the environment that I call this one. Service role, you can select the same service role, my code deploy role that we created in previous labs. It's going to be an in-place deployment. We need to select the Amazon EC2 instances. So we already know that we have a development machine with Amazon EC2 instances. So if I go in that, I have to run an instance. One of the environment that I already deployed is a development environment, and it has a tag called environment equal pre-prod. So let's use this one to select this dev machine. So the key is env, value is pre-prod. And then I need to select on-premises instance. So on-premises instance, I know that I use the tab env, and the value that I gave is my pre-prod. So it could be two different values if you want. just to make sure that I'm going to use the right one. You can find that my laptop has the tag environment my preprod. So that's the one that I'm going to use. So I use environment as my preprod. So far so good. I can define code deploy default all at once. So everything will get deployed in one go or one at a time. So in this case, I'm going to select all at once. So it will be much quicker. I don't have any load balancing, so disable it and then click create deployment group. So I create the deployment group. It has Amazon EC2 instances. Any instance with the tag environment equals preprod will get selected for this deployment. And it also has on-premises instance, and any on-premises instance where the tag env equals my preprod will get selected for this deployment. So the obvious next deployment is to do a deployment. So let's do that. We already know as part of the deployment that it's going to copy some files into C temp folder. So in my laptop, I have cleared that temp folder to observe how it's going to work. And even in my development machine, there's no any temp folder, so that it will get created automatically. So let's do a deployment. Applications, my Donkey application test. My hybrid environment is the one that we want to create a deployment, and click create deployment. You can select the deployment group as my hybrid environment. It's going to, the revision for this one is going to come from an application stored in Amazon S3. We already know the location of that. It could be something like S3, my build artifacts, my Donkey app deliveries. So this folder we created in S3, and these are the deliveries that is coming from our Azure DevOps server. So in this case, I'm going to select existing static file and then use it to deploy into AWS. If you want to know like where this gets saved, you can go to always S3. And under S3, you know that in my case, I'm putting them into my build artifacts, my Donkey app deliveries, and these are some of the artifacts that got delivered. So let's select the latest one that I delivered here, which is in this case 2019 01/31/6. So let's select that. And there's no any information I want to give. There's no any overrides. Keep it as default. And now create the deployment. So it's starting the deployments. If you go into the deployments, you can find the deployment is running. Select that, and it will go there and then execute this deployment. You can find the progress of this installation. In one is one of the EC2 instance, another one is my laptop. All the steps were successfully executed. So if you go to your instance folder, you can find that in my laptop, my Donkey application has been created. And if you go into your development machine, they're also under temp folder, my Donkey application has been created. So in that way, we can now target instances in your on-premise instance and also in the cloud. So it allows you to do hybrid deployment very easily. If you want to unregister these on-premises instance, if you don't want this my laptop registered here, you can always do that, but you cannot just go here and then delete it. You need to do it through command line. So if you don't want this my laptop registered on AWS console, you can easily do that. To do that, go for PowerShell. So we use the register cd on-premise instance command to register it. To unregister it, you call it unregister cd on-premises instance, and then you give the instance name, in this case my laptop, and that will unregister the instance. So if you go here and then click refresh, the instance is no longer registered. We know that our on-premises instance was associated with an IAM user. It's generally a best practice to remove that user if you remove the instance that is associated with that. So go to your IAM users, and under users, We know that the user that we associated with our on-premises instance is my on-premises machine user, which has Amazon S3 read-only access to download the software. So if you go into the credentials, this is the credentials that we use to register our on-premises instance. And this is the credentials that is saved in the on-premises instance CodeDeploy agent. So if we no longer need to give it access, make it inactive. And also you can completely remove that key so that AWS CodeDeploy agent running on this on-premise instance will not have access to that. If you want, you can also delete the user completely by selecting the user, and then you can delete the user.